Observe.
And welcome to the Observe and Rapport Show, episode number 27. I'm Kyle Brennan, joined as ever by my beautiful co-host Keith Sullivan. Keith, how are we doing today?
Couldn't be better, pal. Couldn't be better. What do you think of these?
These are nice. We
Not
got some nice
bad.
microphone, custom Observe and Rapport
They're called
logo.
mic flags.
Mic
I didn't
flags.
know. But hey,
Yeah.
saw something on Amazon. I was like, why not?
I feel like a reporter on CNN.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. When I first sent you, like, look what I got. And it has a CNN logo.
Yeah.
And you were like, what are we doing?
I was like,
I'm like, no. It's going to have.
I thought you got a CNN
sir.
mic flag as like a gag gift. And I was
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
that's
no.
cool. Thanks.
But we're good. Biden's out of the race. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
You know, we were talking about quiet quitting the other day. And he quiet quit. He just performed incompetently for years, didn't seem to really give a shit about the job, and then just quit through a text.
And then he's still working for 5 more months.
Right.
So-
But like he's like, by the way, I'm not really into this whole thing. I'm
Yeah.
probably just going to leave soon. It's a quiet quit.
Yeah.
The president quiet quit.
Hey, good for him, you know?
God bless him, bro. I mean, look, maybe he'll just enjoy the rest of his days and just the way an old man should.
Yeah.
It is on the
hope
porch
so.
in Delaware.
Maybe he picks up painting like George Bush.
Sure. You know, or he croaks out there marking trees like George W. You know,
It's a crazy thing I recently learned about, and I forget if I said this on the podcast, but George Bush, W. Bush, has not been a president for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
He's still younger than both Trump and Biden.
It's nuts, and he looks like it's almost like he's more presidential now. Like if you hear him talk, he's so like he sounds so much smarter than he used to sound, and more like. You know, he doesn't do that whole, like, he'll say something and then kind of, like, do this dumb Southern smile.
Yeah, the Will
like,
Ferrell impression of him.
Yeah. Listen, I mean, people hated that guy. Whatever. I'm sure he was another warmongering psycho of a politician, like, deep into it. But as a kid, I just thought, that guy's fine, you know?
Yeah. You know who's really pumped that Kamala's back in the race is Maya Rudolph.
Why?
From SNL. She does the impression.
She's like, my career's back.
Yeah. She's like on standby for SNL.
It'd be like if Hillary came back for, what's her name?
Kate.
I'm not a big SNL guy.
But that also just made me realize, who does Biden? Does anyone do Biden on SNL?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it's someone specific, but I saw Jim Carrey doing him last.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's not, that's a guest thing.
Yeah.
Someone will get the job, you know? But like, he's on the way out. Maybe they're just going, let's just move on to Kamala. But like they got to bring Shane Gillis back just for that Trump.
Oh
he
God.
does the best Trump.
Did you see the Kill Tony?
Yeah, dude, hilarious. And like he's 10 times better than Alec Baldwin at it.
And what's the guy's name? Adam Carr? No.
Yeah, something like that. Short last
the guy
name.
who did Biden was so good.
It was great. Brilliant episode. So speaking of politics, I really do want to get into what you were reading because it sounds like it's very relevant right now.
Yeah, it's so good. So I'm reading a book called What's Our Problem by Tim Urban. Tim Urban's a guy I've been following for years. I've probably talked about him with you and on this show before, but he has a blog called Wait But Why, where he just drills down like huge essays about any topic. So he's done ones on like aliens, AI, just philosophy, time, life, politics, whatever it is. He's extremely smart, and he just breaks down really complex issues with super simple language, but then he also does these like 4th grader stick figure diagram drawings. So he explains it to you like you're a 4th grader, but not in a dumb way. He just like makes it really simplistic and gets down to like the first principles of every topic that he discusses. And one of my favorite articles by him, I've mentioned it a dozen times, is The Tail End, which it talks about basically our relationship with time and how little time we have left. And he does it with all these.
He breaks down like you have 100, like you have like 20 Christmases left if you're this age, right? Something like that.
Or like you'll only see your parents this many more times in your life if you're 30 years old. And it's very depressing, but it also opens your eyes to like
make it count.
But the book by Tim Urban called What's Our Problem is basically a breakdown of modern political society and how the political landscape that we have in 2024 basically came to fruition over the last century. And he explains it by breaking down all of sort of the mental models, the moral, the cultural values in America particularly, where all these different events took place and the types of psychological behaviors that basically have led to things like wokeness, social justice, but also Trump and all these other things. And he breaks them down in really cool sort of like graphs with like XY axes, and has these like cartoon drawings that I love. And basically a lot of the book, what he explains is from a left to right axis on the bottom, are like political sort of stances, right? So left is like super progressive, right is very conservative. But more importantly, he says one thing we don't talk about when we talk about politics and how people think is from the bottom up, which is basically low rung thinking and high rung thinking. So high rung thinking explains is basically thinking like a scientist or approaching things with a independent mindset, right? So high rung thinkers have moral consistency. They seek truth. They convince through persuasion. And they're willing to say, I don't know. Whereas low rung thinking, which is instinctual in all of us and the human species, is when we basically seek confirmation, right? We cheat, we use coercion, we have moral inconsistencies, and at any given moment in U.S. history, the left or the right political parties will be anywhere along that spectrum on the bottom from left to right. But what we don't talk about is the low rung versus high rung thinking, which is I thought was really interesting. And he breaks it down like so incredibly. Like it's not just high rung and low rung, but it's also like the higher mind and the primitive mind, and how we're susceptible to falling into either one of those categories at any given time. But in a liberal society, and I mean liberal in sort of like the true nature of the word, which is like pro free speech, pro liberty and individual rights, it's very easy for us as humans to basically fall back into our instinctual tribal nature and act more like an ant colony, right? Like attacking others because they disagree with us. But America is unique in that we have sort of this high-rung immune system, which is constantly keeping that animalistic or primitive mind in check, right? So when people usually in politics, it's a spectrum, right? We'll go to one extreme to another, but we always have this high-rung immune system overarching that keeps everything sort of in balance, right? You need progressives to challenge the status quo and to come up with kind of fringe ideas that maybe 80% of them are ridiculous, but 20% of them push the needle forward. And you need conservatives to basically be like, whoa, let's slow down. Let's think about this. Maybe the way things are is actually fine. We don't need to go that far. But within this sort of like high rung immune system, it's basically when we are thinking in a sophisticated manner, we're willing to make compromises, we're independently thinking. And the way he describes all these things is just incredible, where the higher mind, when we get together as a collective group and think independently using liberal values, we basically create what he calls like a genie, like a giant genie, meaning like the collective consciousness is all thinking in the higher mindset. Mm-hmm. And collectively, we build a genie of scientific thought that moves the needle forward. But on the opposite end of that spectrum of primitive thinking, we build a golem, this giant golem that can take over things and kind of destroy things. It's really interesting. I mean, we can get into it and talk about some of the specifics, but at a high level so far, like the book is really dense. It's like 700 pages, but he makes it just so digestible, and like I can't put it down because it's so wise and like just informative on everything that's happened over the last 100 years in America.
Sure. It sounds though that like he obviously is putting the progressive standpoint in a literally, as he puts it, higher, like, he's holding it up to a higher, like as if that's the better way to be thinking. Like, I'm just saying that, like, it seems that, like, the conservative values these days, they're just automatically considered to be, like, primitive or old or wrong. And I don't know, like, I just gotta say, I feel like conservative values, they're old, but maybe they're old. Maybe they're not old. Maybe they're the ways of acting, behaving in a societal way as a collective that seems to be the most stable and seems to be the most appropriate if we're talking about longevity. Like, I think that there needs to be some kind of a pullback to a more conservative, traditional kind of way of, conducting yourself, or ourselves rather. Like, I just think that now it's such a sexy thing, forward thinking, higher thinking, as he puts it, progressive thinking. And that's obviously what we should always be doing. But I feel like the table's so tilted to the progressive end that a lot of things are getting muddied, and like, people forget that we really do depend on, things we all agree on, things that we all can say is true. 2 + 2 = 4. Like, even like, just as I just say that, like, Terrence Howard is talking about how 1 × 1 = 2.
Yeah.
Like, it's getting to a point, I think, where it's like, hey, not everything needs to be changed.
Well, so he's actually he's a progressive, or he's a Democrat himself.
Yeah.
But he's extremely neutral, I think, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And he actually later in the book attacks the, like, current day sort of like social justice, progressive, like wokeness. Right. Like, that's like half the book actually is attacking that. Right. And the higher mind, when I say that's on the vertical axis.
Okay.
That's just ways of thinking, meaning like how you think. So the bottom axis, from politically left to politically right, is what you think.
Right.
Right. So like your stance on gun rights, abortion, etc. And you could be anywhere on that spectrum. But the vertical axis is basically how you think. So are you someone who, once you adopt those beliefs, like, you are just like rigid in them and refuse to change, right, and you attack other people who don't agree with you? Or are you of the higher mindset, meaning you have those beliefs, but you are willing to engage in like constructive conversations. Right. You're willing to let other people with dissenting opinions argue with you. You invite them into your home.
Yeah, because what comes along with conservatism is this, like you say, like, just this staunch, like, I am not, this is how I feel about this, and anybody who disagrees with me is wrong. But now that kind of like personality trait is being adopted on the left as well. Like, they won't talk to people who, think Trump isn't that bad of a guy. They won't. And like, so they're also committing the sin of like not thinking in that higher, just civil way. This is what RFK is trying to bring back into the country, is like, we can disagree. We don't have to, like, you don't have to just hang out with everyone who thinks like that's an echo chamber, right? That's just, yes, we're all on the same page. We're all right. Everyone else is wrong, and they're evil because they're wrong. What they think is beyond, it's fascism, it's racist, it's all these things that it's just not. Like, at the end of the day, like, just because someone disagrees with you doesn't mean that they're against you. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, and he tackles like every single subject that me and you were probably going to bring up on this conversation. Apologies if I cut you off, but
no, we should.
But he literally does an entire massive chapter about the Republican Party and how those he explains how like the Republican or Democrat Party, their ideas live in this kind of amoeba where it changes and ebbs and flows over time. So at some points in time, it might be more staunch on a certain subject, and in another area of time it might be like more loose on that subject, and it changes over time, right? We've seen this, how parties flip in their decisions and stuff. And
like, it's like that thing. There's these videos, not to cut you off, but there's videos of people going around, asking, the average American young people usually, what party do you think Abraham Lincoln was affiliated with? And they all say Democratic, or that he was a Democrat, whatever. And it's like, nope, he was a Republican, and they just literally can't believe they think he's lying.
Yeah.
So like, that's you would imagine, right? So
yeah. So he talks about how the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, it was the party of Reagan, and now the party of Trump. And he explains a lot of other presidents during that time, but those are kind of like the big ones that really changed and made foundational effects on society. And he explains how Reagan, and he pulls some excerpts from his speeches, spoke in a very, agree with him or not, he was sort of a stalwart in the conservative party. He spoke in a very higher mind, sort of like bringing people together, right? And he was very, if you listen to his speeches, like it doesn't sound like he's attacking another party, right? And it's the same thing we've seen recently with like the clips of the 2012 debate between like Romney and Obama, how civil
it was amazing,
they were, right? So that's a perfect example of like higher mind thinking. Right. It's willing to engage in civil discussions and have these conversations. And like, remember when McCain, some lady was like, Obama's an Arab, and he's like, no, Obama is a great American man. Like he's good for this
Whereas
country.
the politician these days would jump on that and use it and weaponize it.
So it's interesting how
does he get into why this is happening? Like, what's our fucking problem, Kyle?
So, I mean, that can probably take a whole podcast to sort of like go.
But this is what I want to get into, man, because I think I might know what the problem is. Not me. Like, I have my ideas about why this is happening. I'm curious why he thinks that.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's obviously multi-layered and multifaceted, but particularly some of the main things that he talks about are geographic disparities, actually, which he shows through a lot of data how, back in the 1950s, you lived in definitely like, you lived in neighborhoods of people very similar to you, right? Like if you were Irish, you lived in an Irish community. If you were Jewish, you lived in a Jewish community. But within that community, the political views might have been very diverse across the spectrum. You might have lived in between a Republican, a Democrat, a moderate, whatever. Whereas now, for whatever reason, a lot of people are flocking to places where everyone agrees politically, which is interesting. Whether you live in a city, everyone in that city kind of has those same political ideas, or generally speaking. And if you live in a rural area, people tend to live in areas where everyone there is also in agreement with whatever those political values are. And that's changing a lot of things, because the dinner conversations, the grocery store, like the people you see in town, the bar, no one is really engaging in debate about other particular objects. And therefore, it's hard to be mean to someone face to face, right? Like if I saw someone who disagreed with me politically at the bar every day, it's hard to be mean to them, right? If they're like a friend of yours, you might disagree with them. But now, between living in sort of these politically isolated areas and social media, where you definitely don't have to see people face to face,
keyboard warrior,
and the fact that social media is curated to what you agree with, creating even more of an echo chamber. The echo chambers have never been bigger, and they've just compiled and compounded over the last 20 years and just made it virtually impossible, if you are of a certain political ideology, to escape that echo chamber. Even if you don't think you're in it, because your YouTube algorithm. I remember someone, did you watch The Social Dilemma?
Yeah, I think so.
The documentary on Netflix that came out like during COVID about like the dangers of the algorithm on everything. I'll never forget this one guy in it. He said something about that really struck the tune to me. He was like, you go on Wikipedia, right? The Wikipedia that I see and the Wikipedia that you see, if we research a subject, it's the same exact thing. It's like, now imagine if that Wikipedia article was curated and catered to your interests and your likes, right? Me and you would be getting two different sources of information if we researched, the JFK assassination. And that's exactly what's happening on social media, and we don't realize how manipulative it actually is.
Sure.
So there's that. I mean, those are like the two.
And
main
that mixed
things.
in with the Abilene paradox we've talked about.
Yeah.
That mixed in with that, it creates this whole like global situation like that you're describing. Yeah. I mean, like, I do want to get more into it, like what I think the issue is. And I'm not a religious person, but I'm talking about the concept of religion and what it does for a society. And what it does for civilization in general is like it creates this pinnacle of a higher, not even moral, but just like this way of thinking about the world, a framework, right? Like a lens to see the world through. And now that that's definitely gone, like completely gone, like, and at least in most parts of the country anyway, God is dead. But Nietzsche said that like 150 years ago, but like he was right. But even if it's, forget morality, like it's just a place we can all call home, and we don't have that anymore. So like you don't have that with your fellow American anymore. The anti-religious, the nihilistic, hedonistic kind of like way of behaving was really cool when we were like 10. You know, like that was cool to be a rebel, like fuck that shit, like you can't tell me, like, but now as you get older and like I feel like that spread so far, now it just seems like there is nothing for anyone to even agree. Like even that's why the politicians are just constantly insulting each other. Like there used to be like just a very, at least civil discourse, but like now it's like hatred. And because since that's gone, there like the ideas in general, right or left, are so extreme that you can't agree on them anymore. So I just think that that's a huge part of it too. And again, I'm not saying we all need to go to church today or tomorrow or whatever. It's not about that. It's just that I think that absence.
Yeah, I don't know. There's definitely an argument to be made about the value that a religious backbone sort of provides to a structure. And we've talked about how this country was obviously founded on a lot of Judeo-Christian values as well as like Greek sort of Enlightenment stuff. And I think a lot of people try to associate the decline of America, or like however you want, the fall, with the fall of religion. And I do think it is a potential factor, but I don't know if I agree with you on how big of a factor that is.
I tend to think it's bigger than you think it is.
Yeah. So I think there are correlative effects of what a religion provides, which I do agree, the moral framework of some sort. But at the same time, a Christian can still hate a Jew, and a Jew can hate a Muslim. So from that standpoint, like you can still look at your neighbor as like someone you don't like. What I think is missing, and there's been articles talked about this a lot, is this concept of like a third place, right? So you have two places, and everyone has two places in their life, which is like their home life, their family, and then their work life. And the church or the temple or whatever it was used to kind of be the third place where people got together in a community. And even if you fucking hated your neighbor Frank, you know, you saw him at church and you had to be civil, right? So you might have disagreed with him, you might have hated him, you might have hated his family, but at church you kind of, you know, forgot those for an hour or so. You know, you shook hands, you got the sacraments together, or the Eucharist. And I think that's more of what's missing potentially, is the fact that there's really not the same level of like community environments, like a Knights of Columbus or something like that.
Well, that's what religion provides. People tend to think so negatively about it, but like the reality is that religion, what it really provides, if you look at it from a social perspective, it's ideas for the future, sacrifice for the future, and community. Those are the two pillars that hold up religion, like you're talking about. And without that, it's all now, and, you know, forget my community. It's all about me. It's all about me and what I want and what I think is right. And everyone else, forget about everybody else. It's all about me, and fuck everybody else. If they don't think what I think, they're wrong. And I shouldn't have anything to do with them. What do I need them for anyway? Without that, like you say, framework, it creates this hedonistic society. And I think that's what we're living in now. You're one of the only people I know who does things for their community. You volunteer at the fire department, you know, but just that alone is enough. Like no one does anything like that anymore. I mean, not like the way it used to be. It used to be so, like, even just going bowling, being in a bowling league used to be part of the community. No one's in a bowling league.
Yeah, think about our grandpa. He was involved in everything.
Everything, the church, you know, like the golf club, like everything else was just like a part of it. Like it was.
Yeah, everyone had, like, back in the 50s. I feel like everyone had like these extracurricular activities where they knew their neighbors, they knew everyone in their town, they knew the guy at the grocery store, like.
Yeah, and like now I know that Netflix and all these things play a part in it. And like it's impossible to find the culprit for this, but it is just a blanket kind of thing. That's why I go to religion a lot, because it's like, again, I'm not a priest, or I don't believe in half the shit. It's just that it does seem to be the thing that's gone. That's the most obvious part, you know. And like I try not to be moral about it. Like let's get into abortion. Like I'm just saying, like for example, abortion. I choose to look at that issue through a purely secular lens, because you can go all day about how because they always chalk it up to the religious freaks think it's wrong, that it's just a bullshit religious idea that you shouldn't be able to kill a fetus. And it's like, forget about that. Let's talk about how, like, what are the main reasons that women have abortions? If you look up statistically, they've done, a million, surveys about this. It's always some socioeconomic reason. They just feel like they generally can't afford it. That's the number one reason. The second reason is they think it will intervene with their career or their education. It'll, fuck all that up for them. And it's like, if you look at the pro-life, opinion about that from those perspectives, you can imagine a world that would develop where it would become indisputably necessary for women to have more rights than they've ever had. So, like, coming from those two standpoints, it's like, let's just say a state goes full pro-life. You can't get an abortion, right? Just disregarding medical issues like the mother's life or the baby's life. The women would then be in a place where they can say, well, we need 3 years full pay, maternity leave, because I'm not giving up my pay because I have to have a child. And it puts them in a place to say something like that, or like, there should be free childcare, or I should be allowed to pause my education without, penalties and then pick it up when I'm ready. Like, all of those things would fall into place eventually in a world where you can't get an abortion. And then, like, women would be entitled to more rights than they've ever had. So, like, it just you would hope. Well, again, this is all very optimistic. This is all very optimistic, but forget about the religious part of it. Like, that could create. So it's like a long. If women started to think, here is a white man talking about women's rights to choose, but like, if they thought long term about the problem, they would probably end up in better positions. Because again, it's not like getting an abortion is going to Disneyland. It's the best day of your life. And I know it's not like a Cannibal Corpse cover, like it's not like a horrible thing, but it's not like it's the greatest day of your life.
Yeah, but
you know what I'm saying?
You could also argue on the other side that if a state went full pro-life, that is revoking women's right.
It is revoking a right.
Yeah.
But it would create a scenario where they would end up potentially, I know this is all like optimistic.
Yeah.
But like,
I feel like that's very
it's
optimistic.
very optimistic. But think about things that have happened in the past where things have become illegal. Like, for example, Uber exists. That's not a government funded thing. I understand that. But if drunk driving never became illegal, which it wasn't, by the way, for a very long time, Uber wouldn't even be a thing and it wouldn't be successful. But like, I'm just saying, when society puts people in these corners, other things get put forward and invented and become absolutely undeniably necessary, like I said, so that everyone kind of wins in the end. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just a way to look at it, and that's purely secular.
Yeah. I kind of see what you mean, that if pro-choice wasn't even an option, what you're saying. Disregarding medical issues. You're saying potentially there would be some sort of private company that came along to solve some of the issues of socioeconomics with maybe free healthcare or subsidized healthcare in some way. I don't know if a government answer is
usually isn't the best answer.
Not the best answer, but maybe like some sort of Uber for like parental leave and help with educate. Did you know this? I forget if I've ever brought this up. I met someone, this was like about a year ago, a lady who was from the UK, and she was pregnant. Either UK or Australia, I forget. But same thing. But
very similar accent.
But she was explaining to me how she was starting an app in the US. She had just moved here to Brooklyn because in the UK, every woman who goes to the same gynecologist who is pregnant at around the same time, they form a community. And they basically exchange numbers, and they kind of have like a WhatsApp text group where they're all going through the same stages of, second trimester, third trimester, and like, here's what books to read, and here are the like different, equipment I bought for the crib and everything like that. And that's normal in the UK. And she said in the US, there is nothing like that.
Right.
And she said that's a huge untapped market.
It's yeah. And do you know what the UK stance on abortion is? It's got to be pro-choice.
I know in general, I feel like Europe has pretty progressive rules, but they're generally speaking, I feel like they're very like level-headed, and it's like a perfect medium of what like the US thinks of totally pro-choice up to the last day, and then like totally pro-life, like no abortions. I think a lot of the countries in the UK have some sort of like 14-week cutoff limit that I feel like if you don't have a strong opinion on abortion either way, like that to me sounds somewhat reasonable. Yeah.
So we can move on.
Yeah, no, sorry. But speaking, you brought up kind of like having different opinions from someone and sort of like castigating them based on that. And me and you both recently read John Stewart Mill's On Liberty.
On Liberty, yes.
Which is John Stewart Mill. I was introduced to him. I read this book called like A Little Book on Philosophy, and they had a chapter on each great philosopher over time. And the chapter on John Stewart Mill, who I didn't know much about, was probably my favorite chapter. And On Liberty is his famous essay that he wrote in like 1859 or something like that. That basically explains individual rights and the unique place that America is in with the fact that we have that. And one quote that really stuck out to me was he said, I had to write it down because I don't have a photographic memory like you. But John Stewart Mill and On Liberty said, the worst offense for society is holding individuals with opposing views as immoral, which is pretty much kind of what we were talking about, which right now, that is something that's incredibly common. And I think Tim Urban talked about this in his book where he thinks that disgust is probably the worst human emotion because disgust in another person basically means you dehumanize them.
You're dehumanizing
which is exactly what happened in Nazi Germany. It happened in Rwanda with the genocide there. And as soon as we start looking at people with opposing views as immoral, meaning, oh, I don't just disagree with him or her about abortion, they are actually an immoral person, and therefore they're disgusting. They deserve to be silenced. They deserve to be put in harm. And that's also the massive part about what John Stewart Mill talks about and Tim Urban, which is the critical two-step or two-rule foundation of America and individual rights, which is, number one, you can do whatever you want, right? Like live and let live. Mm-hmm. The second rule is the most important, as long as you do not do harm to others.
Direct harm.
Yes.
So the problem with that,
direct, yes,
in my opinion, I feel like you find that essay to be brilliant in most ways. My thing is, though, is that if we're talking about a society, a civilization, a country, a nation, direct harm, great. No one's being directly harmed. But what about indirectly harmed? Like indirect harm long term is just as bad as direct in a way, right? Like, you didn't stab anybody in the neck, but what if your behavior is not good for your community? What if it's not fulfilling or contributing to society, but with just having children, or you're maybe you're addicted to drugs and like therefore you're not doing as well as you could be at work, or you're too lazy to join a community service or something like that. Like those indirect harms compile. And so over time it becomes an issue. So like, I get where he's coming from, and everybody should have autonomy, just like I can do what I want to do as long as I'm not hurting anybody. That's a very sound thing to say. But if we're talking about society, it's like there needs to be a bit more, in my opinion, like just more guardrails in place so that we kind of end up going in the right direction instead of just either staying here or going backwards.
Well, there are like actual definitions of what harm is comprised of. I think it's like 8 or 9 different things, but it's like libel, plagiarism, incitement, like all those sorts of things that you can actually be legally charged for. But what Tim Urban also talks about in this book is how the like sort of bookends of what is considered harmful have expanded massively over the last 10, 15 years. And I think the biggest chapter in the book is actually about social justice fundamentalism, because he has to break down how this all came to be, because it's so complicated between and all these terms that you hear, right? Like Marxism, postmodernism, critical theory, and like all these different things, and he has to break them down.
Yeah.
But what he explains is how a lot of it happened through colleges, which we've seen through campus protests recently and the Evergreen stuff with Brett Weinstein, all of these different things over time, where college students now have effectively labeled anything that puts them in a position where they have to change their views or be put in an uncomfortable situation, they define as harmful.
Yeah, like what the hell's wrong with dressing up like Pancho Villa for Halloween? Like, I mean, like seriously, like, but like literally, because like at Yale, that's how a lot of this shit got in the news anyway.
Oh,
years ago,
there's way worse examples.
Oh, yeah, no, of course, but this is like the one that was like a big deal because it got everybody obviously really upset because it's like, okay, the guy wore a sombrero and the traditional clothing of Mexicans. Like, how is that harmful? Like, you could consider that an homage just as much as you could a denigration. You know what I mean? Like, what's wrong with it? And like that, but it seems though, like you say, like everything's harmful.
And the reason for that, again, is way too complicated to try to explain on this podcast. But yeah, basically he explains how what happened was this social justice theory where social justice and like civil rights used to be a very liberal pursuit, meaning higher mind thinking, liberal in the classical term sense, right? Like free thinking, independent, willing to say, I don't know, willing to question the status quo. Social justice from that standpoint is not a bad word. What happened in the
not at all.
What happened in the last 30 years was this sort of, again, to use those terms, like postmodernist, Marxist, critical theories, which didn't just try to break down the rules and the societal norms. They wanted to break down the structure beneath it.
Right, the foundation.
Meaning that everything in American society is inherently ingrained and permeating with privilege and racism and power from
the patriarchy,
from white people, from whiteness, right? So you see all these books with Robin DiAngelo and Ibrahim Kendi X or whatever, basically preaching like white fragility and the caste system. And somehow all of this language and all of this theory has just been indoctrinated into colleges, into companies, the DEI. And how has it been able to permeate so effectively, like instantly?
I think that it's probably one of those, you know, common situations where, you know, it's like there's a law firm, I forget what state it's in, but like their whole goal is to completely eliminate, you know, injustice for, you know, minorities in the legal system, right? But the reality is, if they can't solve that problem, because then they won't have a job. All the lawyers will have no cases. So like, it used to be these very obvious things, civil rights and social justice, like, you know, the separate water fountain, horse shit, and segregation, all that obviously wrong.
Yeah, and equality of opportunity.
Right, all of that stuff. But like when those things got handled and sorted out in the legal sense, like there is nothing that I can do that a black person can't do. There is like legally, you know, societally anyway, like there is nothing like forbidding anyone who doesn't look like me from doing something, right? That used to be the case though. But since those issues were solved, they're like, all right, well now what can we tackle? Let's tackle being on time for work. Yeah, that's a white thing. How about that? That's a white thing. Like that's not necessary. Like why does that have to be a, you know? So like they just started attacking these things that aren't necessarily issues. They're just kind of, you know, what's the word? They're foundationally expected in society. But like they're trying to tear them down because they have nothing else to really tackle.
Yeah. Well, you know, what I love in the book is that Tim Urban calls it the force, because it's kind of this like invisible, unseen thing that is unprovable, but it's also unfalsifiable.
Right.
So if a black woman was to argue with us right now about, you know, the inherent racism that exists in everything, it's unprovable, meaning if we actually pushed her and really tested her ideas, she couldn't really prove it with like factual evidence.
Right.
But it's also unfalsifiable, meaning me and you couldn't really like provide evidence that it wasn't true.
I heard an interesting...
So he calls it like the force, where it's just like, well, it's implied in everything, which is completely antithetical to high rung thinking.
Right.
It's basically starting out on the basis that this is how things are, and like there's no arguing it. Like it's defining the hypothesis before you even start the experiment.
The issue is that you can't prove anything. I heard this recently in a religious debate about the existence of God, right? And they was like, well, I can't, they were like, prove that your God exists. Prove it. It's like, that's ridiculous. You can't prove that we're even having this conversation, actually. I mean, yeah, I mean, like, we're sitting here, we're talking, and like, you're hearing me and I'm hearing you, but that's based on evidence. Like, we could be dreaming right now. You don't really know. You can't prove that this is happening, right? So in the same way that I can't prove to you that Napoleon existed. There's just evidence to back that up, right? So when you bring up evidence to these claims that, what's like to find something that was the most ridiculous one. Like tardiness is whiteness. Like that's a white thing. That's not a real concern. It shouldn't be a real concern in society. It's like when you bring up evidence as to why being late is bad and being on time is good, they get all upset because like I'm disproving what you're saying. And like you said, they're starting from this place where it's a fact and you can't argue it. And it's like once you argue it, their shit just falls apart. And it's like that's the issue. And like so like the thing with that is once they get into that world, you have to destroy everything. You have to just create this world where everything is a problem. And and this is where you get into a world like in the Holocaust, for example. There were so many issues in Germany that were legitimate, but he just had no choice but to blame it on a demographic at a certain point because he was trying to create the world that the German is the superior. But the reality is a lot of this was Germany's fault, like their shortcomings or whatever. But if you blame a person or a group of people, it just becomes like, fine, we'll deal with, that's fine. Like anybody, if anybody's in a bad enough place or believes they're in a bad enough place, like Adolf Hitler got the Germans to believe, they'll just quickly blame it on a whole group of people and go, that's not my fault, it's them.
Well, also what he brought up, which was interesting, was I think it's obvious in this like very like DEI, social justice fundamentalist group that anything a white man says is basically obviously not credible, right? Because it's a power structure, it's patriarchy, it's
based on privilege.
But on the other hand, if there is someone of a minority of some sort, whether it's like a black man or a Muslim woman who disagrees with the social justice DEI stuff, they're so brainwashed by the white patriarchy culture that they're also discounted.
Right. So basically, they were calling Larry Elder meet the black face of white supremacy.
Yeah, I think it was. Which, dude, he actually in the book they have a speech of Larry Elder where it was kind of like a Jordan Peterson type question, which is like why are men overrepresented in STEM fields versus women? And Tim Urban provides the excerpts from Larry Elder's speech, and it's like the most like neutral, sort of like safe, like I'm not offending anyone, but like statistically men tend to exhibit these attributes and women tend to, not want to get into fields where they're working hard and long hours into their 40s when they have children. And it could also be discrimination could also be a factor as well. And like this could also be a factor, blah, blah, blah. And he was viciously attacked for this speech. And he eventually had to step down because one lady in the crowd walked out halfway through the speech because she was so nauseous at what he was saying, because it was antithetical to the entire social justice framework.
Yeah, and her ideology.
That men and women aren't 100% equal in every field. And she went to newspapers, she went everywhere. And of course, these newspapers didn't like put anything from the actual speech in the article. They just quoted whatever she said. And it was like, Larry Elder says women can't do science. It's like, right. It's just these crazy things.
And they'll blame it on we didn't have enough ink, right? Like or something like that. But like this ties into what we were trying to get into before, which is the political landscape right now. Like just the fact that Kamala, now that she's the Democratic, she just got all the delegate votes, like she's going to be the person. It's already like you just hear people straight up saying like, well, she's got the black vote and Trump is for the non-educated white man. And it's like, it's just the most racist shit you've ever heard in your life. Like, what do you mean? How do you know? Like, why are you speaking for every black person in existence right now? Like, she's been the candidate for 40 minutes. And we're talking about how she's got the black vote. Black people are so happy about this. And I'm like, you don't know.
Did you interview every black person?
Right. Like you don't know how people feel about this yet. But again, it's so racially based now that it's just becoming, it's what politics is again. You know?
It was actually interesting. In the last book I read, Malcolm X talks about how the first time he went to like outside of America, he went to Europe, the Middle East, Asia, all these different places. It was the first time that he didn't quite feel the same racial tension. It's like obviously some of those countries have, Europe in general can be very racist, but it wasn't the same, like, I guess, just baked into everything as it is in America. And ever since I read that from his perspective, now if you pay attention to the news, social media, everything, there's never an article about two people where they don't say the race of the person, which of course it is important. But it's definitely hyper focused in America.
Sure,
but
but again, like the narrative in the media, all of a sudden, immediately, everyone's talking about how well she connects to the youth in this country, and she raised $81 million in 24 hours, and this is Kamala. Like the news is already up her ass. Just like, and I learned this from COVID. There are people in the country who, unfortunately, they just do not know how to think critically for themselves. They just don't do it at all. Whatever the TV says is the truth, period. Like once CNN flipped on Biden and everything, all of a sudden, all these people who were like blue no matter who, Biden no matter what, like they all were like, yeah, he shouldn't be the president. Like, and I'm like, you just flipped like that just because an anchor said so. And now that anchors are saying that she's the greatest thing that ever happened, everyone's going to start thinking that now. So like, it's just a weird thing where the media gets involved now to a point and makes it racial and makes it sexism. Like, she's a woman, he's a man. Like, and like, it's just terrible. But like,
yeah, you have to form your own opinion on.
But there are millions of people in this country that do not do that. They will just blindly.
Well, people don't have time. That's the thing we always
How long does it take to form a thought?
Well, how many people actually spend the time caring so much about politics that they're reading all the articles? Like,
that's true.
Like
too.
In my opinion,
I mean,
the political landscape in the U.S., it's reality TV, right? So the people who watch reality TV, they are hyper focused on like the drama that's happening. They know the main characters, they know the loud ones, but how many people could actually name their representatives from their state?
Oh yeah, I couldn't.
Exactly. You know the ones who are really loud. You know the ones who get the media coverage.
That's right.
You know the ones who are portrayed on reality TV of CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, because that's like the WWE, and like they're like, hey, look what happened this weekend. You'll never believe. Coming up after this commercial, Kamala said this. And for people, a lot of that is just entertainment.
Yeah.
So
that's true.
They're not using it to think critically. They're using it to feel a certain way, to get entertained, to get embroiled, to be annoyed.
For me, it's the principle. Like, have your own opinion, please. Yeah. Like, what you see is out there.
That's high-rung thinking.
It's never been easier to formulate your own opinions, and people still just won't do it.
Once you see through the matrix of just like how much the media and the government try to... Propaganda is a strong word, but there definitely is a level of that. But a lot of it's just manipulation and persuasion. And once you see through it, like you just see all the bullshit, because you have to, like, now that Kamala is potentially most likely the Democratic nominee for president, you're going to see all of these hit pieces from the right on her about how much of an idiot she is. How many
black people she put in jail when she was
all these like all the hate and everything and vitriol that maybe she deserves in some cases. And then on the other side, you're going to see the love, the praise, how she's this fantastic role model for everyone. And you have to look at both of those critically and be like, oh, these are written with a clear slant and bias. So ignore that. Look at what the media said about her a year ago, 2 years ago, when she wasn't getting the coverage. Because that's going to be at least a little bit more honest.
I heard a guy say today, he goes, like they were giving him, a fastball of a question, like just like name what you believe is like, this is someone who was like her campaign manager or something, and they were like, what do you think is her greatest accomplishment? And the guy goes, well, she solidified the middle class financially or something, and it's like, what? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Like you can't, again, people just say these things.
Yeah.
And people hear that and go, right. She
clap.
solidified the middle class. That's what she did. And it's just like, you can see the hypnosis in their eyes. It's like, it's insane. But getting back to why this is happening, like what's our problem? I just want to sum it up a little bit with like, what do you think if you had to say what it was?
So Tim Urban describes a hypothetical like fairy tale land, and I think this does a really good job at like describing maybe not what is our problem, because I haven't finished the book yet, and what's the solution.
Think for yourself, Kyle. Form your own opinions.
But he basically describes this fairy tale land called Hypothetica. That's led.
I love that.
It's led by a king named King Longbeard, and King Longbeard is this majestic king who lets everyone live freely, and there's a thriving capitalistic marketplace, and everyone's allowed to open their own businesses and practice religion and free speech however they wish. And then King Longbeard dies, and along comes his son, King Mustache. And everyone makes fun of King Mustache because he looks stupid, he like talks funny, and he looks weird. And one day, King Mustache is giving a speech, and someone says something critical of King Mustache. And again, this is a fairy tale land where everyone's living very happily. And one person happens to speak out, and King Mustache says to his royal knights, "Kill that person, hang them." And the knights all pause and look at each other because they've never killed anyone. They've never had to do that. They've always lived in a free land where everyone's very peaceful and loving. And they all look at each other and they pause, and, you know, they don't want to necessarily disobey the king, because then is he going to kill me? And I don't want to look like I'm disobeying the king in front of the town square. And they all simultaneously think that. And so one guy steps up, and then all of them step up and they say, "Yes, we'll hang him." And they end up hanging the guy. And now everyone in that town of Hypothetica lives in fear of being critical of the king. And suddenly people aren't speaking as freely anymore. Suddenly now there's restrictions on their speech, even though no one ever actually imposed it. The knights who conducted the murder are now a little bit fearful of their job, even though none of their rules ever changed. There's just this sort of thin veil of fear that the king might impose his wrath if you say something critical or if you go against his orders. And it's all because everyone was actually in agreement in that town square. They didn't want the guy to be hanged. No one wanted to hang the guy, but no one was willing to speak up because they thought everyone else was thinking something differently.
So it's the Abilene paradox.
In a way.
That's what's wrong with it. No, but like,
it all comes back to that.
It does in a weird way. And like, but it also is like that famous, I don't know if it was an actual experiment, but it's an anecdote like you're describing of the monkeys and the bananas. And there's all these monkeys in a room, and like there's a ladder up. The ladder is this bunch of bananas. And eventually the monkey notices, and one of them goes up the ladder and grabs a banana. And once he touches the banana, they spray him with ice cold water. And it's very unpleasant and horrible, right? They spray them all with it. They spray all the monkeys, get treated badly. And time goes on, and every time they try to go up there, it gets sprayed. And over time, you know, it's that monkey dies of old age, and so do all the other ones. And then they keep putting monkeys in the room, and eventually, there are no monkeys that were there when that happened, and they all just freak out when someone tries to go grab a banana, and they don't even know why. It's like kind of like that. It's like now there's just this precedent in the culture where like you can't, don't say that. So
yeah, and the thin veil that I'm understanding through reading this book is that the common higher value is always to stick to your personal principles, meaning like.
But also with remaining in that place where if someone disagrees with you, you don't have to hate them. You shouldn't hate them. Like you can be a nihilist. You can be a nihilist and just not believe in anything besides just chaos and anarchy. But you can still like be a nice guy. You know what I mean? I used to go to punk rock shows. Like I used to be in a metal band. There were people there that I just like was like, dude, that guy's out of his mind. But we were all having beer together after. This guy was definitely not somebody I would ever call to hang out. But like, it doesn't mean you can't get along, you know?
Yeah, I think the message is really to seek differing opinions. Look for people who disagree with you, intellectually diverse, not by racial or gender or ethnic lines, but seek intellectual diversity, because what intellectual diversity builds is that hive mind genie, not the hive mind golem, right? Tribalism and groupthink and echo chambers build that hive mind golem that's dangerous and that just thinks collectively and thinks in low rung ideas. But intellectual diversity across a broad range of things, Jonathan Haidt had this, he cites this study about one of the most important studies on homelessness that was ever done over the last 30 years. And the reason it was so important and done so well was because, number one, it wasn't conducted through a university, which universities are, generally speaking, like 90%.
They're biased.
90% Democrat leaning. There's like almost zero Republican professors at modern day American universities. So it was done through a private company. But what they did was they got together a pool of researchers with intellectually diverse backgrounds. So they had 50% of them were Democrats and 50% of them were Republicans or thought in those sort of camps. And the Democrats conducted the study in homelessness on, on racial, ethnic, gender backgrounds, the things that progressive social justice find important, because that is an important factor in homelessness. While the Republicans or conservatives looked at homelessness in their study through the lens of, work ethic and things that probably would be offensive if it was conducted through a university. But for conservatives, those are the things that they also identify as things that potentially could lead to homelessness, right? Socioeconomic, their attitude on money, if they were married or not, if they were brought up in a single household family, right? If that was conducted by progressives, they would be like, oh no, you can't ask about their personal lives. You can't ask about their relationships with people or their background. And that's why this study was so good, because it brought together both sides and formed a intellectually diverse viewpoint
solution too,
across both aisles, and conducted research that was groundbreaking because no one had ever combined, as sad as that sounds. Like, that's how every study should be conducted. But unfortunately, in a lot of these universities, which Tim Urban talks about, it's 95+% progressive democratic values. And that trickles down into a lot of the social justice, a lot of the campus protests, a lot of this rigid ideology that's happening in college campuses in the US today, and what's eventually leading into corporations and DEI and all this stuff. And now job applications are requiring DEI statements before you can even apply to it, which reduces instantly a huge pool of qualified candidates. And it's all these just ridiculous things that people are just too afraid to stand up and be like, hey, this is fucking stupid. What are we doing
right
here?
The reality is education and self-enlightenment and all that stuff, like figuring out what you truly believe in your heart. That's the answer to all these things. Expand your mind. And then if you do, like, dude, you know me, bro, I've read the Satanic Bible. I've looked all over it, the place, for like what I think is the right thing. And I found it eventually, I think right now. And I'm sure in 10 years I'll have different opinions maybe. But it's important to read everything, go through different walks of life and check out what is out there, and you'll find it. You can't just stay in one corner and go, no, everyone else is wrong. Everyone else is wrong. It's like,
part of me is like a little bit jealous of people who just say things with total conviction. And like,
who's that?
Just people who are, they're so convinced that they're correct on everything.
Yeah, right.
Right? Where like, and they're just like willfully ignorant to other ideas or viewpoints. Like, part of me is jealous of that, because I feel like I try so hard to read things on diverse spectrums that I almost end every sentence with, but I could be wrong.
Right.
I don't really know.
Well, that's the meme. It's,
yeah.
Look, hey, let's,
but I'm
I'm
pretty much constantly, when I seek out like books that I'm reading, I'm constantly being like, maybe my whole like philosophy or idea on this is wrong. So let me read a book and try to learn a little bit more about it.
Yeah. But usually when that happens though, don't you find that you kind of go back and go, no, look, I get some points that they're making, but still though, I think that the right way of looking at this is this way.
Yeah. I mean, the best example you brought up was the Joe Rogan episode with Matt Walsh.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, those guys were talking about gay marriage and like why Matt Walsh is against it and Joe Rogan is for it. And it was the most civil discussion you've ever heard two people have on the subject.
But sure. Totally disagreeing.
Totally in complete disagreement about the rights of gay people to get married. And I think gay people should be able to get married. I don't have a problem with that. But you at least I now understand why Matt Walsh thinks that. Like, people just think God hates the F word, and like these religious fanatics are they're insane. Like, it's like they're hateful people. It's like you got to understand, like, there is whether you like it or not, there is a world where that argument is sound. Yeah. For whatever moral, religious reason, it's like, it's not the reason you think it is. Like, I'm not going to try and do it right now, but listen to it.
Yeah, like I completely disagreed with Matt Walsh because his whole idea was marriage is meant to create a family, and a gay couple is not able to procreate in the same way. And Joe Rogan's argument was like, yeah, but what about heterosexual male couples who can't have children?
Right.
Which kind of like defeated a lot of the arguments. But listening to that podcast, which that conversation goes on for probably 45 minutes,
I think it's a 45-minute
or an hour.
Conversation, yeah.
I came out of that being like, well, I still hold firm on my sort of view on gay marriage and that I'm fine with it. Right. But I also exposed myself to Matt Walsh's viewpoint. And while I disagree with him, I understand why he feels that way and don't hate him for it.
Right.
I just disagree.
You're doing yourself a favor. You become less aggressive towards people that you disagree with because you go, oh, I guess like not everyone's just a psycho. Like, what are the chances that everyone but you and the people who you think are right are just completely insane? That's not true, right?
There's this whole idea that like if you grew up in someone else's life, right? Like if I was born Keith Sullivan and you were born Kyle Brennan, we would be the exact same as we are now because we would live through the same exact life experiences. Right. And we would have the viewpoints of someone who grew up in that environment. So like if you grew up the way Matt Walsh did, you would probably have his feelings on gay marriage because your life, your environment, your culture, the people you were around inflict a lot of those views onto you, and that shapes your worldview. So it puts it less as like, oh, this person's immoral, and just, well, maybe if I grew up in those circumstances, in that state, in that culture, in that religion, maybe I would actually have that same idea and people would disagree with me.
1,000%.
So who am I to say that he's wrong or he's stupid or he's immoral in some way?
Let's close it with this on what you just said. Speaking of like this woman had that mentality, and there was a young kid, 16-year-old kid, black kid, and he was from a
gotta say he's black, don't I?
Exactly. I'm part of the problem. But no, but like I mean, like he was from like obviously that story. He's from a ghetto, and like he was from a bad neighborhood, and like the whole thing, and you know the oppression and whatever, and like all that. And it was the 80s and the crack epidemic and all that. Ended up trying to rob someone's house, and he tried to break in and broke in. They were home and ended up killing this old woman, and went to jail for 25 years, and got out a little early through good behavior and whatever. And that woman who he killed, her daughter, heard about this kid, and she was very woke, and she was totally into the whole like hey man, like it's definitely just because of his upbringing. I bet he's really not a bad guy. If I was in his shoes, grew up in that environment, I'm sure I'd be doing the same thing. I bet he's not even a bad guy, right? I bet was just in a bad place and did something stupid, and he shouldn't be judged for the rest of his life. When he gets out of jail, I'm going to get him a job. So she did. She got him a job. She ran this like organization, whatever, and he shot her when he got there. Swear to God, true story. He killed her. Swear to God, he killed her. They found her body at the top of her stairs. He went into her house and he strangled her to death. Swear to God. I swear to God.
I thought we were going to end on this beautiful, just perfect bow. Wrap it up.
Killed her, I swear to God.
Oh, you see what you get for being woke and nice.
See? Oh, I felt bad for her, though. That sucks, man. But you know what? Hey, maybe I bet it could have worked out if he was a different dude,
Somewhere, so I wish I could interview that lady's aunt who probably was just like, I told her. I told her.
I don't know where you heard about this woke bullshit, but that he killed somebody.
He's a killer. He's still a killer.
Yeah. Shot somebody. Yeah, he killed her. Swear to God. So, hey, what the hell do we know, man?
What do we know?
All right.
Beautiful. Thanks, everyone, for listening. That was a good one.